Welcome to the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove. Today, we're going to talk about Gen Z perspectives on the world of climate change. Generation Z is now the world's largest demographic group, representing over 20% of US population and over 25% of world population. Generation Z comes after the millennial generation and is generally defined as people born from 1997 to 2012. Most members of Gen Z are the children of Generation X and older millennials, and Gen Z makes up 27% of US workforce. Staggering 57% of Gen Zers are receiving university degrees. So this is a very large generation and a very educated generation. Members of Gen Z have grown up in a period of political unrest and social change, of climate crisis, of COVID pandemic, during the Great Recession of 2007, and the creation of the US Department of Homeland Security. They've also grown up with life-changing technologies like mobile computing, and social media. Gen Z is the most tech-savvy generation in history, whereas the previous millennial generation grew up with cable television, landline phones, and the internet. Gen Z has lived their entire lives fully connected digitally. Most Gen Zers received their first smartphone around the age of 12 and have had continuous access to streaming content and social media ever since. Unlike the millennials who lived through an era of open and personal posting on social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter, Gen Zers have tended to grow up using anonymous platforms like Snapchat, which allows them to keep their audience limited and have their messages disappear after being read. Today, 98% of Gen Zers have access to a smartphone, and 54% of them spend over 4 hours a day on social media. 1/3 of all social media influencers are Gen Z. Gen Zers include people like activist Greta Thunberg, Malala Yousafzai, actor Jenna Ortega, singer Billie Eilish, gymnast Simone Biles, poet Amanda Gorman. Climate issues are a major concern for Gen Z. Early political movements like the school strike for change, which was modeled after Greta Thunberg skipping school to protest outside the Swedish Parliament. These political movements brought millions of young people around the world out to protest in favor of greater climate action. Gen Zers have sued the United Nations and U.S. states, winning climate cases in places like Montana and Hawaii. Yet the failure of governments to take meaningful action on climate change has caused Gen Z to report more mental health issues than previous generations. 43% of Gen Zers report feeling depressed, anxious, and hopeless. 19% of Gen Z students have struggled with suicidal ideation. I want to acknowledge that the climate crisis is clearly the fault of the boomer generation and, to a lesser degree, Generation X. And let's acknowledge how incredibly unfair it is to pass the climate crisis on to future generations. But as more and more Gen Zers enter the workforce and political arena, we have to acknowledge that they not only are the future, but they're going to have the largest impact on the future. And that we all need to understand their perspectives and solutions and to provide them with the resources they need to survive and prosper in the world ahead. We're joined today on Zoom by Rhea Goswami, founder and executive director of the Environmental Justice Coalition. Rhea is an environmental justice activist and a student at Cornell, where she researches how to make improvements to sustainable transportation using math. Hi, Rhea.
Hi.
Olivia Ferraro is a climate activist and graduate of Harvard University. She is the co-founder of Climate Cafe, New York City, and is passionate about slowing down and reconnecting with people on the planet. Hi, Olivia.
Hi, Bob. Thanks for having me.
Elisa Teles Munoz is the K-12 programming manager for the Climate Mental Health Network. Elisa is a climate education specialist, project manager, activist, and youth mentor. She is the founder of Earth Minds Consulting and works with small nonprofits to develop education programs. Elisa graduated from American University in 2022 with a BA in International Studies with concentrations in environmental sustainability, international development, and Latin American studies. Hi, Elisa.
Hi, Bob. Thank you for having me as well.
And thank you all for being here. Let's just jump right into the deep end of this. The current administration's attacks on climate and environmental issues is regressive and anti-science. Lisa, how is Gen Z dealing with this climate denialism?
I think that a lot of Gen Z comes out with some like tongue-in-cheek comments, but I can't say that you can generalize the entire generation's reactions to this. There are some folks who have taken to the streets and have protested, and then there are some folks who feel kind of apathetic and are like, well, our commander in chief feels this way. What can I do about it? And so there's a huge range of emotions and reactions. There's a lot of finger pointing amongst ourselves and amongst our generation versus other generations. But I can certainly tell you how I feel and how my peers feel. I feel really angry that Trump has called it the Green New Scam and made a joke about rising temperatures and oceanfront properties. I feel like making light of a really serious situation is never funny. And I think this is a bipartisan issue that we should all come together on.
Olivia, can you talk about the recent Lancet Psychiatry Commission report on youth mental health?
Yeah, definitely. And I think this is very much related to some of the sentiment that Elisa was mentioning. So the Lancet published a study earlier this year, or maybe it was late in 2024. It was basically a survey meant to be representative of youth populations in the United States. And they surveyed, I believe, 1,600 or more young people on the ways that they would describe their feelings about the climate crisis, both in how concerned are they, do they talk about it with others in their lives, what kinds of natural disasters have they already lived through, all of these kinds of questions. And the resounding take from it was that youth are very concerned. 85% of youth said that they're at least moderately concerned about the climate crisis, and large proportions of those of folks in general said that they've experienced some sort of anxiety or depression related to the climate crisis. So in general, I think we see that there's a uniform sense of discomfort of something being very wrong. You mentioned in your description of Gen Z that we've grown up in a time of political tumult, exponentially growing tech advancements, and a general sense of the social order being kind of changed right under from us. And I think that the feeling about climate impacts kind of follows suit in the sense that we have this feeling generationally that the world that we grew up in or that we were taught our parents had is not the same one that we'll inherit. And I think that that discomfort might come out in various ways. Not every Gen Zer might feel frustrated or disgust at some of the anti-science, anti-climate action comments made by the current administration. Some might feel that, the solution is that we just need to shake everything up, that sense of like, well, we need some sort of disruption because what we have is not working. So I think that across the board, we see that youth are very distressed by the state of the world, specifically the concept of what the future will hold for us, but that distress can come out in various ways. Obviously, the three of us here are very distressed about climate and are working on it in a way that's different than how our current administration talks and acts on climate. I think for folks who feel like us, this study was kind of very confirmatory, very validating that this is an urgent problem that we must solve, and that the feeling of urgency is shared across everyone, regardless of how it may manifest in their actions.
Rhea, how does Gen Z and other people, how do we maintain optimism in this period of despair, of denialism?
Yeah, I think the best way to maintain optimism is, in a way, getting involved, is finding what really brings you joy and why you ultimately care about making the world a better place and making it so that the environment sustains itself and becomes healthy. And ultimately, that can look like different things for different people. Some people really enjoy, for example, volunteering at their local library, and that's something that is like really crucial, is a really crucial part of like community building. I think that's really how people can derive joy. They can also derive joy, like as you mentioned, like Gen Z, we are a lot on social media, we're a lot on our phones, and that can be often what causes a lot of our distress as well. Like constantly seeing bad news articles, constantly reading like on social media. A lot of Gen Zers get their news from there, and you constantly see this onslaught of like really negative things happening. So it's important to remind yourself that good things do happen and like go read about those good things. There's good advancements in science. There are countries that are taking steps, and there are movements around the world and people making the world a better place. And it's not necessarily that like we always have to focus at a national level. Something that's helped me, at least in my personal experience, is like really working at a state level. Each state is so different, but be able to more directly impact people has something that has allowed me to have joy. But also finding your sense of community is really important, because in times of despair and grief, the people we fall back on are communities.
Lisa, in some of our earlier conversations, you talked about Gen Z kind of falling back into armchair activism. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I think that to build upon what Olivia was talking about with this survey that affirms how Gen Zers are feeling across the board and across the political spectrum. Sometimes these feelings of hopelessness and powerlessness need to manifest themselves somehow, and social media has become a really key way to do that. And so this idea of armchair activism is, using your social media platform as a way to speak out when you're highlighting something on your Instagram story, which is a representation of all the things that you feel, but not in a way that compromise your Instagram aesthetic. It's a way that you can announce for 24 hours on your social media page, like, I endorse or agree with this, or I vehemently do not endorse or agree with this, and here are my thoughts. And then people can swipe up and reply to you. And this is kind of seen as a way of speaking up and speaking out, but ultimately this disappears within 24 hours. And I'm not trying to completely knock this practice. This is the way that discourse happens among our generations. And that's just the truth of it. But what I want to challenge is the idea that that is the only way that we should be engaging with these issues in a public way. And I think that there's so much more value in being an actual activist or challenging social spaces in your own personal life and bringing up these conversations with your parents in an intergenerational way, for example. Or if you work with youth that are even younger than yourself, finding ways to bring these conversations in an age appropriate way up with them, or even with your friends, rather than just kind of, sighing and saying, yeah, the world today it's really messed up, it's really challenging. So anyway, what did you think about Love Island? Kind of just taking a moment to really acknowledge how complex things are and discuss them with your friends. Even if your friends don't agree with you, it's actually Olivia on a call we had maybe 2 years ago that brought the idea to me for the first time, that was, maybe we shouldn't be afraid of being quote unquote downers in a conversation with somebody. Like, that shouldn't be our guiding fear. We should be more afraid of not talking about these things. And I actually, Olivia, I'm really glad that you said that to me a few years ago, because I think about it all the time. And anyway, I think that's the best way that we can combat this whole armchair activism thing.
Olivia, you've described climate distress as the gauntlet through which humanity must walk to create a livable future. Tell us more about that.
I really appreciate that attribution, although it is not my quote. It's actually a researcher named Rhea, who's written a lot on the topic. She has this book called Generation Dread, which I would really recommend if you're interested in learning more about climate distress, and particularly how it impacts young people. Rhea is a millennial. And all of her research and others who work in the field have kind of pointed to the uniform conclusion that feeling distress about the predicament we face, the current state of the climate, and the outlook if we don't change anything is like a very normal response. In fact, it would be abnormal if you were not at all distressed by how things are going and how things will go if we don't do anything. And her whole body of research is basically devoted to this idea that the world that we need to create together involves so much change. It's not a simple matter of turning our electrical sources from hydrocarbons to renewable energy. It's change in a really transformative way, how we do everyday business, what kinds of products and clothing and household goods we're buying, the frequency with which we're buying those things, who's making them, where are they coming from, what are they made out of? Basically, like the fabric of our society. And the only way that a transition like that happens realistically is with a lot of buy-in, because it's something that requires a great deal of effort. And the idea is that we see a rising tide of people experiencing climate distress. For the last, I will say, handful of years, that's when it's become more of like a publicly acknowledged phenomena. That's when more research has started to come out about it, but it's also been happening for decades, since the beginning of the environmental movement in the 60s. That's when we saw really widespread recognition of the predicament that we're in. So all of that is to say that feelings of climate distress, many researchers believe, are kind of like the beginning of the personal motivation to contribute and co-design what this new world will look like, because it will take so many of us. And the idea is like a lot of people are having a very human reaction of like, I'm very upset about this. What should I do? And the answer is not to uniformly tell everyone that this is a pathological problem, that you need some sort of individualized treatment plan to deal with your climate related anxiety or depression. Sometimes those modalities can be really helpful for people, but more of a recognition of like, this is a social problem and you feel bad because the world feels bad. We're connected beings to everything around us, whether or not our conscious mind wants to describe it that way. So yeah, the idea that like our feelings of distress because the planet is in distress are the layer beneath our conscious activities of like, this is something that we need to be living in tuned with, and we have to walk this path of feeling very distressed in order to get to the other side of living within our ecological limits.
Rhea, what are your thoughts about climate anxiety and being pushed into action?
Yeah, I can speak at least from my own experience. That's pretty much how I got involved in like like environmental justice and the climate movement. I think a lot of Olivia's points really resonate with a lot of activists that I've spoken to. And it's this idea that like freaking out, so to speak, is really normal. And the way that that can be channeled is sometimes you have like a lot of energy, you have a lot of like restlessness, but like, what do you do? And a lot of the anxiety can manifest because it feels like no one is doing anything. It feels like the needle has kind of just like stayed stuck for the last like decade or so. And like, it's just like worse and worse and worse things are happening. And so the way that I've coped, and a lot of other people I know, and some people who may listen to this can also look into, is by taking action. Taking action has helped do a number of things. Like I talked about before, building community. You meet a lot of people, you meet a lot of like-minded people who are worried about the same things as you, and that you can talk about it in an open and safe space. You also see that there is more to the environmental movement. Like oh, I think Olivia or Lisa, one of you guys said that the climate movement isn't going to be like solved with like one solution. And then you see, once you peel that back, you see that there's so many areas where people are working and that the needle is moving, although slowly progress is happening. And so you take this like climate anxiety, you take this kind of sadness and grief, and you turn it into something that helps people, works with your community. And like you do this thing, like Elisa mentioned, like you don't you no longer sit back and just like watch things happen. You now like put yourself at the forefront of like making change happen. And I think I was reading an article recently, and it's like it was about this idea that like every activist has to be like really great and has like made this like monumental contribution to like the climate change movement in order to be like an activist, or like in order to be allowed to be an advocate. And I want to just like dispel that rumor, because, or like that idea, because at the end of the day, an activist is simply just someone who wants to make a change and has radical ideas and like different ways and unique perspectives on how to do that. And anyone can be an activist, anyone can be an advocate, no matter how minor your changes and contributions are. And so I think that kind of like limitation, once we like open our mind beyond that limitation, we now open ourselves to this world of like imperfect activists and people like 100 or 1 million people who are trying to make these very small changes that then amount to the needle being pushed a little bit more.
Bob, I
Olivia,
was curious.
go
Oh,
ahead.
go ahead. I would love to say something also related to what Rhea mentioned and kind of our conversation at large. You mentioned the word radical in how you would describe being an activist as having radical ideas, and I think that's often very true. I think a lot of the work that I like to think of myself as doing when it comes to climate and mental health is like really pervasive cultural ideas that caring about other people and climate is radical. And I think a lot of the work around like normalizing conversations, like Elisa was mentioning, is just like frequently reminding people like this is a very normal thing to say. Like let's stop calling it radical to be like, oh, I would like to live on a planet that can produce food when I'm an adult, or like I would like for my grandchildren to have clean water. And like I really want to lean into that idea of like there's nothing weird about this, you know? This is like a super humane experience to be having right now. Anyways, yeah.
I also would like to comment on that. That's in every presentation I've ever done for work. This is at the core of it, especially when we're talking to people who are caregivers or teachers, parents, etc., the people that interact with young people, whether that's college students or below, you know, K through 12 as well, is that we tell them that you need to constantly remind people that it's okay to have emotions on this particular topic and to have opinions and beliefs that you talk about. And, you know, I also think that the idea of from anxiety to action, the idea of being a change maker, quote unquote, is something that people our generation have been hearing a lot in the last 5 to 10 years. Being a change maker was like the brand of my university at a certain point. And I think that this, you know, like linear pathway that we're imagining of like from complex feelings to action to activist is really something we should start to complicate a little bit more and reject this very simplistic way of imagining that, because not everybody is in tune with their emotions and ready to do X thing at any given moment. There's a curve that we often reference, and if you can imagine a graph, and on one axis is climate action, and the other axis is emotions, and it's like a bell curve. On either end of the bell curve, you're not engaging in action. One, because maybe you're not feeling a lot of emotions, and on the other side of the bell curve, because you're feeling way too many emotions and you don't have any capacity in between that space. Where you want to be is at the peak of the curve, where you are able to self-soothe and be resilient and are capable of engaging others. And at that point, you can begin to remind others of everything that Olivia was referencing, that Ray talks about, where grief comes from a deep sense of caring. You understand that, and you can remind other people about that. And I think we don't really have time to entertain people being on either end of that bell curve. We really need to be at a point where we can encourage others, because we ourselves are already in the center of the curve.
For several, you mentioned the linear path towards becoming an advocate or an activist. Is there a non-linear path, Rhea?
Certainly, I think like Elisa and Olivia like provided really good reminders that the word advocate, activist, change maker, these are all things that are very nuanced. And the experience to become one of those or not become, whether you want to put a label on it or not, like doing actions itself is a non-linear path. And I want to like hone in on what Elisa said about like being in the middle and like making sure that, you know, you care. At the end of the day, the people that we want to make everyone care. And typically people who are in the middle are people who have this like sense of like you just have to be action driven. Sometimes that's like you have a lot of emotions and you're really action driven. This is a very nuanced conversation. The conversation around mental health and the path to becoming an activist are really nuanced, and we can only sometimes speak from our own experience of like going from point A to point B. For me, it was a pretty linear path, but for others, it may not be. And like a non-linear path can look like, for example, that you care. And the way that you know that you're like, okay, like I care and I know I'm good at X. Sometimes you don't want to like necessarily get involved at the community level, but you do want to make conversation. Conversation is something that we all have every day. And so you like consciously choose that like, okay, today I like want to have this very tough conversation with my friends, my family, my children, my parents, whoever, and you make that decision that you want to like bring up climate and you want to like educate people. That's like that's for example, like that's making like steps in the positive direction. But that's not necessarily like you have to do something like so big and so great. And that's kind of like the whole idea behind this like quote unquote imperfect activist. It's not necessarily to put a label on it, but it's just to show people that even the smallest actions that we may not give any importance to do make a difference and do hold meaning within this space. So I think that's like another way of going through like the non-linear activism. You don't have to go like from 0 to 100. You can go from like 0 to 1 to then 2, sometimes back down to 1. Yeah.
You're listening to the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove. We're speaking with Lisa Teles Munoz, Rhea Goswami, and Olivia Ferraro about Gen Z perspectives on the world climate change. Let's talk a little bit about lifestyle choices for Gen Z. How is climate impacting choices like marriage, having children, buying a home? And you can speak for yourself or, you know, speak for your cohort. Lisa, would you like to start?
Sure. It's certainly something I've thought about. I currently live in Miami, and I ended up here a little bit more out of circumstance than by choice. But my parents lived nearby, and they owned a home. I'm renting an apartment, and I don't plan on staying for much longer in my adulthood. But I was really encouraging my parents. There's a climate vulnerability map, and where they lived was a particularly vulnerable area, and I was really encouraging them to move. Especially in South Florida, there was a huge real estate boom right after the pandemic and during the pandemic. And so I was really encouraging them to move while they would still get a huge return on their investment, because a lot of people want to move to this part of Florida right now. And they heeded my warning. They stayed in the state, but they moved somewhere a little less vulnerable, still coastal, less vulnerable though. So it's certainly making an impact on where people want to live, in a way that maybe people didn't think about that in the past. Now, when I'm thinking about where I would like to have a home, I mean, home ownership is something that a lot of our generation feels is out of the cards for them. And if I am so lucky to one day own a home, I am going to be very careful not to buy one in a floodplain. And I'll really, really consider the specific location of my home so that I can make sure that it's a place that I live forever, and hopefully not have to constantly be moving. And I think with childbearing, that's certainly a concern of mine. I don't know where I stand on it. It's very complex, and I think that is something that can change for folks in the coming decades. But I've heard children as young as 14 saying like, "Oh, that was stolen from me. I can't have kids." And that's a really severe thing to hear from such a young person, because at that age, that was not even a thought that had occurred to me, was that, having kids or not as a personal decision is one thing, but the added climate element, that was just not anywhere in my brain. And so when I heard that, I was like, wow, this is something that people are thinking about younger and younger.
Rhea, what's your thought on Gen Z lifestyle choices?
Yeah, I have a ton of thoughts. I think I'm kind of like in a unique vantage point because I'm in college right now. So I think things, in a way, lifestyle, it feels like nothing has changed, which is really interesting because it feels like amidst all of this like chaos and all this like emotions, it feels like people where I go to university like don't care. And that might just be like a result of like the major that I'm in. I'm not in like I don't major in like government or like history. I major in engineering. And so that just might be a result of like people are not aware. People may just be like, I need to get a job. And I think like I have a lot of feelings about like living in a capitalistic society while trying to be sustainable and all of that. And so I think Gen Z lifestyle choices, at least for college students, nothing has changed. And I think that's why like for example, in the Climate Mental Health Network, Olivia and I are on the Gen Z advisory board. That's why I felt like a lot of solace and a lot of like camaraderie when we all talked about these things. Because like in person at school, like I can't talk to anyone because no one gets it. But on a lifestyle point, yeah, I think I resonate with a lot of what Elisa says about like owning a home. I think that's kind of like a faraway point just because of like the socioeconomic climate. Things are just becoming really expensive. And I was actually just talking to my professor about this today, about how there's like a dip in young children. Like there's like a population cliff, I think is what he called it. And it's basically that like kids right around like they're now in high school. So kids who are 14, so they were born in like 2010. Right after that point, there's like a significant dip in how many children are like being born, and like a significant dip in the population will also occur in the United States. And that is something that I think this is like a reflection of the whole conversation we're talking about, that how it's like more expensive to have children. Some people are very validly concerned about like healthcare. They're worried about like how healthy is their child going to be? Are they going to be covered? Can they provide for the child? And also like growing up in uncertainty. I've talked to a lot of people who've had very young kids and are like, I don't know if this is like the greatest climate to be like bringing them up in, because you know they're always going to be stressed. It always feels like what I'm teaching them, they're like just in distress learning about all these things that they need to know to survive in this world. And so yeah, I think overall, I think lifestyle is definitely going to take a huge impact because of climate change. And I think specifically young people. Another way that this like climate anxiety manifests is in this like uncertainty for the future. With the same professor, I was also talking about like he's like, what do you want to do in 10 years? I'm like, I don't know, because what's going to happen next year? I don't know. And so like these whole big lifestyle plans that like millennials and older Americans have had is just like falling apart at the seams because nothing is for certain anymore and you can't hold on to anything. And so yeah, that's just how I feel.
Olivia, I mean, I've read studies say 11% of Gen Zers have moved into traditional family arrangements, and that's dramatically lower than previous generations. Olivia?
Sorry, Bob. You broke up there for a second. Do you mind repeating yourself?
Yeah, Olivia, I've read surveys and such that say 11% of Gen Zers are moving into traditional family arrangements, children, marriage, and such. And that's quite a bit. I mean, 50%, 60% lower than previous generations.
Yes, I would be more than happy to talk about this. I think it's a confluence of factors. I think there's the material reality that, both Lisa and Rhea touched on, which is just that, like, financially, economically, that lifestyle is like very out of reach for most folks in my generation. The differential of salaried versus cost of living has never been higher, at least in the time that we've been collecting this information in the US. So there's that very real fact, which is that for most people, it's just not going to happen. And I think there's another underlying cultural wave kind of at the same time, which is seeing the psychological detractors of atomized suburban lifestyles that are marketed to us in the US as like the pinnacle of success. This is a relatively novel thing. It was only in the post-war period, basically, where we decided to invest in individual home ownership in suburbia as the way of life for Americans. And I think that it's easy to forget that that in and of itself was a totally new thing for the time period, and that for most of our evolutionary history and our recent history, humans have not lived in that way. And I think a lot of people in our age group are having to grapple with the sense that the traditional nuclear atomized family life is just not possible for them. And at the same time, do they even want it? And I think a lot of people, because of those two things, are entering into less traditional living arrangements, like intentional living communities. Maybe they're being more nomadic, living in vans and other types of like co-working locations that are kind of like highly variable, not as traditionally settled as folks have been shown as maybe the model of living. And also, of course, like having roommates, you know? And I think that a lot of these things are much more common in this age group because precisely we observed that growing up in suburbia is probably not good for us. It's not really great for anyone to be separated by a 15-minute car ride to everybody that they know. So trying to think about like, how can we live in different ways? And specifically, like, how do we relate to our built environment? Does that mean public transit? Does that mean walking or bike paths? Does that mean just like having more tight-knit communities where you're getting your groceries, where you're running your errands? This concept of 15-minute cities, which we've seen as like a culture war flashpoint, but is really just the idea of having everything that you need to live your life within like a relatively tight radius to avoid making these really long and fuel intensive car trips that most American cities are known for. So yeah, I have lots of feelings about it. And I think whether or not you enter into that kind of non-traditional arrangement is a very personal choice, similar to the idea of having children. I think another big part of that is for Gen Zers who don't feel comfortable actually parenting a child because of things like the climate crisis or the cost of living crisis. I think it's common even for people who feel that way to still enjoy being around children, to like the idea of having a family. And so thinking of other models of kinship, maybe it's not your child, but maybe you are living in the same building or house as a peer family that has children, and you're kind of presuming like an auntie or uncle role. I think that those are all models of family structures that young people are leaning into because of the constraints on traditional nuclear families that we see when we think about our lives 20 or 30 years in the future.
Lisa, what about the workplace? What kind of jobs and benefits, work-life balance is Gen Z looking for?
Well, yeah, it's having benefits. First of all, it's having benefits and making a reasonable amount to live your life, and to have land. I really resonated a lot with what Olivia said, and I'll circle back on work and benefits. My friends and I fantasize about having our own commune in a walkable neighborhood where we all live together and we raise our families together on a plot of land where we grow our own food and we enjoy each other's company forever, and we share resources and we cook dinners for each other, and you know, that's the way that we live our lives. And we talk about this every single time that we get together, and we know that it's not likely to happen. But my ideal would be to have a job that could pay me enough money to be able to invest in that future that I don't even say it as a joke. Like I really do want that. And I find that this non-traditional way of living, I've experimented with this co-living lifestyles before, and it has offered me so much more satisfaction than I've ever felt growing up in a suburban lifestyle. So anyway, that's like not a job benefit, but that's a benefit of living your life on this planet, is actually getting to enjoy it, and not in a physical, this is my land, I have a pool, I am safe and satisfied. It's in a much deeper sense. Like that's the benefit that I want from this life. When it comes to jobs, Gen Z often want to work in the climate space, but sometimes the pay is just too low, like $50,000 a year, just throwing a number out there. That is not a livable wage. You know, like $25 to $30 an hour, as far as I'm concerned, is minimum wage. And that's not minimum wage in most places. But that's what you need to make to scrape by. And so people in our generation often feel dissuaded from working in climate jobs because there's just not enough money to go around sometimes in them. And, you know, people feel that you have to make a choice. If you're working in this particular space, if you care deeply about it, or making enough money to secure the lifestyle that you want. And that feels like a really unfair sacrifice. I'm doing it right now and I'm making it work, but I am concerned about my future, for example, and the longevity of my working arrangements in many different ways. We want healthcare. It's absurd that the United States does not have healthcare. I've sought out other citizenships for countries that I can achieve citizenships in for healthcare, and that's mind-boggling. This should not be an issue that we're concerned with, but you know, we live in a country where you can go into debt because you have cancer due to no fault of your own. And so, yeah, we want jobs that feel akin to the American dream that we were promised.
That's a lot to unpack right there. That's very true. Rhea, I know you've got a class to get to. Like to give you an opportunity, and we'll continue on with the rest of us. But you know, Rhea, where can people go to learn more about you and you know the groups you're working with?
Yeah, so thank you so much, Bob. I run a nonprofit called the Environmental Justice Coalition. And if you go to environmentaljusticecoalition.org, you'll be able to find a lot of our work over there. You can also see a lot of the work that I'm up to at school and just around and about in environment and sustainability on my website, rheagoswami.com. You can also find me on like LinkedIn, like basically every platform with that name. I have a huge social and like internet presence, so you can find pretty much anything about me, but if you just look up my name. But again, thank you so much to the Climate Hour for having me and having all of us and to be able to represent our perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So continuing on, obviously there's a lot of justifiable anger and hostility, if you will, Gen Z looking at the boomers and such. I mean, I've been working in the climate sector for a long time, and I've been targeted by that hostility and anger. How do we build bridges between Gen Zers and the members of older generations that are, you know, honestly working on sustainability? Olivia?
Thanks for this question, Bob. I really appreciate it. And I think it's something that we don't talk enough about. I think there are a couple of things. I'll start with the first being kind of like more related to climate mental health. I think a lot of young people, and at times I felt this way too, feel frustrated having been handed this predicament from older folks who obviously, like, unless they were an oil and gas executive, really didn't play like a tremendous individual role in this crisis. So the idea of like, it's not right, it's not logical for us to direct our anger at people who didn't really cause this. They just kind of lived through it in the way that we're living through it. It was more of a different time. And so I think the first thing is just like for elders to acknowledge the discomfort and the distress of young people. I think that makes a big difference. I think a lot of it is just talking about things openly and saying as much of like, you know, I might not have done this intentionally. I didn't put this into motion, but I recognize how unpleasant this is for you. I think that would go a very long way with a lot of young people. I think it's similar to how we need to talk more honestly with youth about where we are instead of offering kind of empty sayings, placations, that kind of thing. I think young people just want somebody to be honest with them. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is thinking about how we can move beyond that initial reconciliation of how do we actually work together. And there are a lot of older folks who were involved in political and social movements in the 60s and 70s that in some ways were unsuccessful and in other ways were successful. And I think recognizing that we have a huge breadth of information to learn from people who have been doing this work for a very long time about what went right, how can we use those techniques, or how do they need to evolve? Understanding basically that we're on the same team, and that we have more together than we do separately.
Lisa, how do we build those bridges?
Yeah, I think I've been a part of a lot of intergenerational conversations, and they've been so fruitful. And these often happen in nonprofit spaces. It's kind of like a buzzword right now, this intergenerational dynamics and relationships. But it is really truly meaningful when you offer a younger person a seat at the table in a non-tokenizing way, because you genuinely do care and want to hear from them and what their vision is for the future. I was on a panel at a Climate Week event in fall of 2024, and there was a high schooler at this panel event, and her contributions were the highlight of the event for so many people, because they really, really wanted to hear what she had to say. And she was addressed to and spoken to as an adult and as an equal at this table. So that's the first thing, is offering them a seat. The second is, I think young people don't like hearing that you are the future. It doesn't feel like at least to me and to some people who I've spoken to about this topic, don't feel like it's an empowering message. It feels kind of scary at this point, because the future isn't shaping up to what we are hoping it will be. And so, kind of, it also gives a sense of like, I'm washing my hands of this, you are the future. And it shouldn't be that way. It shouldn't be a passing of the baton. It should be like, we should work together on this as much as we can together. And then I think the final thing when it comes to adults of older age and younger adults is just the acknowledgement of things were different when I was your age. That goes a long way too, of just the acknowledgement. It feels dismissive sometimes when we hear older adults talk about how hard things were for them in a different way, when we just have to acknowledge that there are different struggles among the generations. Ultimately, you might have been able to pay for a semester of college having an on-campus job 40 plus years ago. That is just simply not the case anymore. And so an acknowledgement of that is really important. The final thing I'll say is on Olivia's point about placating worries. I don't think we want to hear that anymore. We don't want to hear that everything's going to be okay, you'll be able to achieve this. It feels like an empty promise, and a promise that no one is expecting anybody else to keep, because we all have that, we all owe it to each other to work toward a future. It's not going to just happen passively. So if there's this like fake assurance that everything's going to be fine, without the understanding from older generations that, I will play a role in this as well, then it feels empty.
It's very solid, and I hear what both of you are saying. Olivia?
I'd love to add something more to this too, which is that a lot of the reasons why young people fear participating in direct action that might be arrestable is because of housing and employment discrimination. And oftentimes, older folks are kind of exempt from those things because maybe they own a home, maybe they're retired. And so they have more flexibility to put themselves on the line for things that are very dangerous for a lot of young people. So I wanted to highlight too that like older people really do have a role to play in being disruptive and participating in direct action. There's a nonprofit started by, I think it was Bill McKibben, Third Act, maybe I'm thinking of 350, but devoted specifically to older folks who now in their third act of life want to get more involved in direct action. So definitely would highlight that, that it's a privilege in a lot of ways to be able to participate in those actions that young people would be personally endangered by.
Lisa, can you talk about Underconsumption core, I mean, that's a trending social media item I'd like to learn more about.
Yeah, absolutely. So just a little explanation, this like adding core after a word is how you describe an aesthetic on social media. Italy core, for example, and then it'll show you a montage of Vespas. But under consumption core is something that I've been seeing a lot more on my social media page. And it's kind of like a parody of these Italy core and or other a little bit more ridiculous aesthetic appeals where you're romanticizing life, your hair is flowing in the back of a Vespa, but under consumption core is trying to romanticize and make it trendy and make it cool to consume less and live off of less. And so some folks will still do it in a semi-glamorous way. They'll show their expensive composting equipment, for example. But I also see under consumption core as like, I repaired this shirt that has been tattered for the last couple of years, and now I've given it a new life. Or under consumption core also is I wanted to buy this water bottle, but I found this one on the bottom of my cupboard, and I will use this instead. And you know, learning how to fix things, cook and grow healthy food, adorning your home with or dried out orange peels instead of LED lights that you get from Amazon, and creating this into its own aesthetic is getting really popular in social media. And it's also like pointing out that, yes, we have this cost of living crisis right now, but under consumption core is healthier for you, it's healthier for the planet, and it's cheaper.
Very much. What would you like to say to Gen Zers listening to this show right now? Olivia?
Oh gosh, that's a loaded question. I would say that if you're feeling climate distress, it's a very normal reaction. You are not alone, and I don't mean that in the empty way of saying it. I mean, you're surrounded probably every day by people who are also disturbed by the state of our planet. And that the first step you can take to like identifying and kind of alchemizing those feelings is simply just talking to people that you trust, know, care about, to identify the ways that you might be feeling equally distressed. There's a lot of comfort and solidarity with other people, and you would be surprised at the avenues that it opens up for you. You know, meaningful action is different for everyone. So whatever action you decide feels right for you and your lifestyle, who knows, maybe it precipitates out of like a really honest climate conversation you have with somebody that you weren't expecting. So I would encourage like listeners to remember that it's a very human response, and that the best way you can deal with these feelings is by engaging with others in your community.
Lisa, what would you like to say to our Gen Z listeners?
I agree that there's a lot of solidarity. There's a lot of power in solidarity. And like Olivia said, I would encourage Gen Z listeners to open up that conversation with folks who they might perceive it to be unwelcome or quote unquote not the vibe. Just try it and see how it goes, because maybe this is somebody that you can connect to on a deeper level. That's the first thing I would say to other Gen Zers. I would also say that, you know, we're seeing a lot of news currently with executive orders that threaten nature, the more than human world, the people who work to protect those places and people and animals. And we should feel our feelings in response to that. But we shouldn't allow ourselves to get to the far end of the curb where we're paralyzed and in fear. We should try to challenge ourselves to be resilient in that fear, because the ominous they, want masses that are immobilized because they are in shock and don't know what to do. And the best thing that we can do is something, anything. If it's a conversation, if it's reading a book, if it is armchair activism, that's something.
Yeah.
So Lisa, what
And
would you, go ahead, Olivia.
this might be an unpopular suggestion, but I also say, like, if the difference is between you knowing every bit of information about this administration's activity on climate and then being totally paralyzed, or turning off the news selectively to actually engage with the information that you do know, like, don't be afraid to protect yourself in that way. I know that it can make me feel guilty to do that, but on a certain level, it's like, well, I have to be functional. I'm useful to nobody, nowhere, if I can't get out of bed in the morning. So don't feel bad if you need to take news diets, honestly. Just maybe it's a couple days here and there, but make sure that you're protecting yourself because you still need to be a functional human.
Absolutely. Olivia, what would you say about Gen Zers to our older listeners?
I would say a lot of what we talked about, honestly, already, just how do we want to interface with older people? Trust that the young people that you know are doing the best that they can given the circumstances that they were handed. Also, just please acknowledge to the young people in your life that the struggles that they face today look really different from the world that you grew up in. And there's no blame to be laid at that. It's probably nobody had any hand in it specifically, but it can be really validating and bring you a lot closer with the young people in your life, just by accepting that in a lot of ways it's very hard to be a young person now in uniquely hard ways. The climate crisis is not something that every generation is faced with in this magnitude, certainly not for young people right now. So yeah, be mindful of that and know that your humility will bring you closer to the people that you care about.
Well, thank you. Lisa, same question. What would you like to say about Gen Zers to our older listeners?
Before I answer that, I want to say that I think our older listeners who had a hand in the environmental movements of the 60s and 70s and 80s should document their experiences. I think that we need reminders of that. If you have a social media presence, you can do it there, or you can write it in a journal, or just document what you experienced in your era is the first thing. And the second is to operate on the baseline assumption that your younger counterparts are capable and able to execute on things that you're asking them to in the workplace, and that your family members are, like Olivia said, doing the best that they can. I think that the final point here is, even if it's an informal intergenerational dialogue, calling your family members or people who are younger than you, your peers, and giving them a space that you are inviting and welcoming them into would go a long way.
Well, thank you. Lisa, where can people go to learn more about your work, learn about the Climate Mental Health Network?
You can follow Climate Mental Health Network's Instagram. It's at Climate Mental Health. And you can reach me at elisa@climatementalhealth.net via email.
Thank you. Olivia, where can people reach you to learn more about your work?
Yeah, the best way to learn more about the work I do with Climate Cafe NYC is Instagram at climatecafe.eco, also at Climate Cafe NYC, and our website too, Climate Cafe, www.climatecafe.eco. .eco is the end of it all. But yeah, would love to engage with anyone listening who's based in New York. We put on programming for local New Yorkers related to climate mental health, community building, group catharsis, basically all the toolkit that you would need as an activist or as a person of conscience to stay tuned in these days. It's a hard task.
Thank you. And thank you to our listeners. We welcome your questions and feedback. You can learn more about the Climate Hour at climatehour.net. That's climatehour.net. This is the Climate Hour. I'm your host, Bob Grove.